He calls it a productive weekend, and what he means is that he did not stop moving. Rest arrives disguised as guilt before it has a chance to register as relief. A body sitting still triggers the same internal alarm as a body caught doing something wrong. You already know this particular pause, the one where doing nothing feels like being watched. Nothing about this reaction looks dramatic from the outside. He puts down the newspaper and picks up a screwdriver within 4 minutes. He watches half an episode before standing up to check the garage, the mailbox, the thermostat, none of which needed checking. Small interruptions like these look like restlessness, but restlessness is the visible edge of something older and less visible underneath it. You recognize the pattern before you can name what produces it, because the pattern has been running quietly for decades. Ask him why he got up, and he will describe it as habit, never as compulsion. He will say he simply thought of something that needed doing, as if the thought arrived on its own. It did not arrive on its own, no matter how automatic it felt to him. It arrived because stillness had already become uncomfortable enough to require an exit. The exit gets labeled productivity so that the discomfort never has to be named directly. This is not a personality trait limited to one man or one household. The same interruption, the same reflexive motion toward some small task shows up across an entire cohort of men now in their 50s and 60s. Each one experiences it as a private habit, something particular to his own temperament. None of them experience it as a shared psychological structure, because shared structures rarely announce themselves as structures. They announce themselves as personal quirks, repeated identically across thousands of separate lives. What makes a reaction this consistent across so many unrelated men who never compared notes? Individual temperament cannot explain a pattern that repeats with this much precision across an entire generation. Something upstream of personality is shaping the response, something formed before any of these men chose their own habits. The explanation has to be found outside psychology in the strict individual sense, in the conditions that built the psychology in the first place. These men were raised by fathers who lived through economic instability that made steady work feel conditional rather than guaranteed. Layoffs in the 70s and 80s were not abstractions read about in a newspaper. They were events that happened to neighbors, uncles, and sometimes fathers themselves. A boy watching that instability absorbs a lesson no one states aloud. Usefulness is not a constant. It must be continuously demonstrated to remain secure. Rest under that lesson starts to resemble the exact moment usefulness becomes visible by its absence. Technological disruption added a second layer to the same anxiety a decade later. Industries these men trained for shifted or vanished within a single working lifetime, sometimes within a single decade. Adaptation stopped being optional and became a condition of continued employment, continuously renewed rather than achieved once. A man who must keep proving relevance rarely experiences downtime as neutral. Downtime becomes the interval in which relevance quietly erodes. Labor culture reinforced the same message from another direction entirely. Visible effort, especially effort extending beyond required hours, became the primary signal of loyalty inside most workplaces these men entered. Loyalty, in turn, became the primary currency of job security in economies that no longer guaranteed long tenure to anyone. A man who internalizes that loyalty must be performed continuously has very little use for a category called rest.
Emotional culture supplied the final ingredient, and it operated earlier than any workplace ever could. Boys in these households were taught early that stillness without visible cause invited suspicion, sometimes gentle mockery, sometimes direct correction. Emotional expression itself was already restricted for these boys, funneled almost entirely into action, output, and results. A boy who cannot express distress directly will often convert it into motion instead, because motion requires no explanation and invites no scrutiny. Layered on top of all this sat an inherited expectation about social responsibility, the unspoken assumption that a man's core value lay in what he provided for others. Providing was never framed as one role among several. It was framed as the defining function of manhood itself. A function that defines a man cannot be paused without the man himself feeling paused, suspended, temporarily unreal. Multiple systems, economic, technological, cultural, and relational, were now pointed in exactly the same direction at once. Geography added a quieter pressure of its own, since many of these households sat in towns built entirely around a single industry. When that industry contracted, the entire surrounding community absorbed the anxiety at once, not just the men directly employed by it. A boy growing up inside that atmosphere learns to read economic uncertainty as ambient weather rather than as an isolated event affecting only one family. None of these systems alone would fully explain the reflex to keep moving during unstructured time. Together, they form overlapping layers of adaptation, each one reinforcing the others rather than operating independently. A man raised inside all four does not experience four separate pressures. He experiences one seamless pressure that feels like his own personality. Recognizing the layers requires slowing down enough to see where personality ends and inherited structure begins. 7 layers of the same underlying phenomenon can be traced from the outside in. Behavior sits at the surface. Habit patterns sit beneath it. Identity sits beneath that, and responsibility sits beneath identity. Relationships form around responsibility. Meaning forms around relationships, and beneath all of it sits something shared by an entire generation rather than owned by any single man. Each layer only becomes visible once the layer above it has been fully traced. The first layer is behavior, the part anyone standing nearby could observe directly. He fidgets during unscheduled time, invents small errands, checks devices that required no checking, straightens objects that were already straight. You have watched a man do this at a family gathering, unable to simply sit through an afternoon without inserting some task into it. What sustains a behavior this consistent for years without the man ever consciously deciding to repeat it? The behavior sustains itself because it resolves discomfort faster than any alternative response available to him. Motion produces an immediate, measurable sense of relief, however small. The instant stillness starts to feel unbearable. That relief gets reinforced every single time it works, which is nearly every time because the underlying discomfort is never actually addressed. A mechanism reinforced this consistently for years does not remain a conscious choice. It becomes an automatic circuit running beneath awareness. What disappeared in the process of that circuit forming so completely? What disappeared was his own capacity to distinguish an actual obligation from a manufactured one invented purely to avoid stillness. He can no longer easily tell whether a task genuinely needs doing or whether it exists only to justify motion. That confusion carries a cost that rarely gets named directly because the man himself experiences it as diligence rather than avoidance. This layer is not the deepest one. The erosion of that distinction opens directly into something more structural. The second layer is habit pattern, the accumulation that turns an occasional reflex into a fixed architecture. What began as an occasional urge to get up and do something becomes over years a scheduled expectation he places on himself without noticing the placement. Weekends fill automatically with maintenance tasks, errands, and minor projects that expand precisely to occupy whatever open time exists.
You can watch a man create obligations out of nothing rather than tolerate an empty afternoon in front of him. What sustains a habit pattern this rigid across decades is the absence of any competing pattern strong enough to interrupt it. Nothing in his environment ever rewarded stillness the way it consistently rewarded output, so no alternative circuit ever had the chance to form. Reward, repeated for enough years without exception, stops functioning like reinforcement and starts functioning like identity. Once a pattern operates at that depth, interrupting it does not feel like breaking a habit, it feels like losing something essential. What disappeared here was any working memory of what unstructured time actually felt like before the pattern hardened. Ask him to recall the last unscheduled hour he simply let pass without assigning it a purpose, and he struggles to locate one. A man who cannot recall unstructured time has effectively lost access to an entire category of experience most people take for granted. That loss does not stay contained at the level of habit, it starts reshaping how he understands who he is. The third layer is identity, where habitual output stops being something he does and becomes something he is. He does not experience himself as a man who works hard, he experiences himself as, fundamentally, someone defined by output. Ask what he does for fun, and he often answers with a project, because leisure without production barely registers to him as an activity at all. You notice this fusion most clearly the moment his output is interrupted by illness, injury, or simple aging. What sustains identity fused this tightly to output is the total absence of a self separate from function that was ever cultivated. No one in his formation ever asked who he was apart from what he produced or provided for others. A self that was never built outside of function has nothing to fall back on when function is temporarily removed. What disappeared in that absence was an entire dimension of selfhood most people assume is simply available to them by default. What disappeared specifically was the internal permission to exist without simultaneously justifying that existence through visible output. He cannot rest and feel like himself at the same time, because resting removes the very thing his self is built from. This is a heavier cost than mere busyness. It means stillness itself now threatens his sense of being real. That threat does not remain abstract, it attaches itself immediately to the concept of responsibility. The fourth layer is responsibility, where the fused identity finds its permanent justification and its permanent trap simultaneously. Responsibility for this psychological type was never simply a role assigned to him within a family or a workplace. It became the very mechanism through which his identity confirms its own existence, moment to moment, task to task. You can hear this in how he talks about obligations, almost always with a faint undertone of relief rather than burden. What sustains this fusion of responsibility with identity is the fact that responsibility offers something identity alone cannot: a constant external confirmation. Being needed provides continuous proof that the fused self still exists, still matters, still has not quietly disappeared. A man who requires that proof daily will resist anything that interrupts the supply, including rest, including delegation, including retirement itself. What disappeared as this fusion solidified was the possibility of responsibility ever functioning as something temporary or shared. What disappeared specifically was his capacity to set responsibility down without experiencing that act as a kind of erasure. He cannot hand a task to someone else and feel relief, he feels a small, specific loss instead. That loss is rarely spoken aloud because naming it would require naming the fusion underneath it, which feels far too exposing. The cost of this fusion does not stop at the level of the self, it reorganizes everything he shares with other people. The fifth layer is relationships, where an identity built entirely around responsibility begins to shape connection itself. He shows love primarily through provision, maintenance, and problem-solving, rarely through unstructured presence or shared stillness. You notice this in how he sits at a family dinner, scanning for something to fix rather than simply being present at the table. His closest relationships often run through tasks, repairs, rides, financial help, logistics quietly managed without discussion. What sustains this pattern in relationships is that it works, in a narrow sense, exactly the way his earlier adaptations worked. Family members come to rely on him for exactly these functions, which reinforces the fusion between being valued and being useful. Each time usefulness earns visible appreciation, the underlying equation, worth equals output, gets confirmed once again, without anyone intending to confirm it. What disappeared inside these relationships is a form of intimacy that requires nothing to be produced or solved. What disappeared specifically was his ability to receive presence without immediately converting it into a task to be managed.
He struggles to simply sit with a struggling adult child without offering a fix, a plan, a next practical step. Relationships built this heavily around function eventually strain under the absence of anything else to offer or receive. That strain quietly redefines what this man considers meaningful in his life overall. The sixth layer is meaning, where decades of fused identity and function narrow what actually counts as significant to him. Meaning for this psychological type attaches almost exclusively to effort that produced something visible, measurable, or useful to someone else. Unstructured joy, aesthetic pleasure, or simple presence rarely register on the same internal scale because they left no output behind. You can hear this when he describes a vacation almost entirely in terms of what got accomplished during it. What sustains this narrow definition of meaning is that it has never seriously been challenged from any direction available to him. Culture around him rewarded output for decades. His relationships rewarded output. His own identity depended on output being rewarded. A definition of meaning reinforced this consistently from every direction for an entire adult lifetime becomes nearly impossible to question from inside it. What disappeared under this definition is any felt sense that rest itself could hold value on its own terms. What disappeared more precisely is the internal category for meaning that requires no output at all to justify itself. He can intellectually agree that rest matters, that presence matters, while still feeling nothing when he attempts either one directly. That gap between intellectual agreement and felt experience is not a failure of understanding. It is the mark of a structure operating beneath understanding entirely. He can attend a quiet afternoon with people he loves and still feel a faint, unnamed pressure to justify the hours somehow. The pressure rarely announces itself directly, it simply sits underneath the afternoon, waiting for an opening to convert stillness into some form of output. In that structure, once traced this far, no longer belongs to him individually at all. The seventh and deepest layer is the collective blind spot, where private experience turns out to be shared architecture. What felt at every earlier layer like his own particular temperament turns out to be a pattern repeated with startling precision across an entire generation of men. No single institution designed this pattern deliberately. It emerged from the overlap of economic anxiety, technological disruption, labor culture, and emotional restriction operating on millions of boys simultaneously. No one man built this structure alone, and almost no one fully recognizes that he is standing inside it. This is what makes the blind spot collective rather than personal. Each man experiences the guilt around rest as uniquely his own private flaw. He rarely encounters language that names the structure itself because the culture that produced the structure never needed to name it. A pattern shared this widely while being experienced this privately becomes nearly invisible precisely because everyone assumes it belongs only to them. That invisibility is not an accident of individual psychology, it is the structure's most stable feature. None of these 7 layers operates in isolation from the others now that the full shape has become visible. The behavior at the surface exists because the habit beneath it demands repetition, and the habit exists because identity requires continuous confirmation. Identity requires that confirmation because responsibility has fused with selfhood, and responsibility stays fused because relationships were built to reward exactly that fusion. Meaning narrowed to match all of it, and the entire arrangement was never built by one man alone, but inherited collectively and repeated identically. Seen as a single structure rather than 7 separate observations, something else becomes apparent about how it holds together. Each layer does not simply sit beneath the one above it, each layer actively sustains the ones adjacent to it, in both directions. Remove responsibility and identity loses its confirmation. Remove identity and habit loses its purpose. Remove habit and behavior loses its automatic quality. The structure is stable precisely because no single layer can be addressed without the others immediately reasserting the same pressure. He remains throughout all of this only a psychological type, not a specific man to be judged or corrected. Nothing about tracing this structure changes him, and nothing here asks him to change, because that was never the purpose of the tracing. You are not being asked to agree with any of this, only to notice whether it resembles something you already recognized before reading it. What felt at the start like a personal habit of restlessness has turned out to be the visible edge of something older. It was built long before he ever had a choice in the matter. The investigation stops here, not because the structure has been fully resolved, but because its full shape has finally become visible. Nothing about visibility changes the structure itself. It simply makes the structure available to be seen rather than simply lived inside. There is another pattern adjacent to this one, involving how the same generation of men relates to asking for help rather than offering it. That pattern remains largely unexamined, still operating quietly beneath ordinary behavior, still waiting for the same kind of tracing this one just received. Thank you for following this investigation all the way through its 7 layers. If one layer in particular felt closer to something familiar than the others, that recognition is worth sitting with, not resolving. Further observations like this one continue on a regular basis, and staying subscribed with notifications on will keep you inside the next investigation as it unfolds.